Kia ora koutou. Again, my name is Susanne. I am a principal at Heritage Preservation and Field Support Solutions. And this is a private practice, and we service a variety of clients across New Zealand and in the Pacific. And I'm also, as Tamsin mentioned, a PhD student at Victoria University, Wellington. And this talk tonight is very much for a general audience. And I excuse me, I'm so sorry, I'm jumping ahead. It's for a general audience, and I hope it's something that you get something out of, but there are a huge variety of people that are attracted to this topic, as indicated by the amount of people that registered tonight. And I think we'll find out more about kind of who those people are and how they contribute to shipwrecks and history in our country. Excuse me, I just want to make sure I get there we go. So just a little bit about the background to set the stage. So why am I qualified to talk about this topic? So I started out getting a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology, specializing in maritime archaeology from the University of West Florida. I'm obviously Tauiwi. I'm from Florida originally, and I married into a New Zealand family, and that's what brought me here. But I started out my career in maritime archaeology. I started diving when I was 13. My brother threw a scuba tank on my back and took me down to like 80 feet. And it was an amazing experience. I think I held on to his fish that he had speared and hung on to the boat rope line. So it changed my life, and it realized something that I wanted to pursue. So it's always been a part of my story. And after I got my bachelor's degree, I decided that I wanted to continue, and I joined the HL Hunley, which is an early Civil War submarine. It's not the first submarine design, but one of the very early ones. You can see it pictured here. And it was most known for sinking an enemy warship, in this case, the USS Housatonic, which was a wooden-hulled ship. Not sure if my pointer works here, but off the front, we're looking at the rear or the stern of the vessel. So we have the propeller there, but at the other end is a torpedo spar. And what would happen is, it's a hand crank submarine. The men inside would quickly crank to move the propeller, and it would jam the torpedo spar into the hull of the wooden vessel. And as they reversed, it would pull taut and a torpedo would explode. So that's what sunk the Housatonic. So I won't go into too much detail because we're here to talk about New Zealand shipwrecks, but this was pretty life-changing for me. All 8 crew were found on board in their original positions. So fascinating story in itself, and very lucky to have worked on that very early in my career. After I wanted to stay with the Hunley, but they told me they couldn't hire me without a master's degree. So I went to the University College London and got a master's in conservation. And I did my thesis project on the USS Monitor. So this is a picture of the rotating gun turret from the Monitor. The gun turret is one of only a few pieces that were recovered. I worked at the Mariners Museum. I worked my way up to a senior conservator position where I was overseeing some of the organics conservation. The Monitor is a Union or a Yankee vessel, and it's an ironclad. It's one of those very first ironclad designs. It was most famous for the Battle of Hampton Roads in Virginia. So they recovered sections of this vessel. It sank during a storm on the way being towed down to North Carolina. And the US Navy had to recover this vessel. So this is a fascinating history on its own, but the material as well is really unprecedented for maritime archaeology and conservation. So I was with this project for several years, and we also had human remains and other unique challenges on this one. After I left the Mariners Museum, I started teaching, and I went to Antarctica. During that time, I spent winter down there doing conservation on the historic expedition huts. All of these bases, while they're not shipwrecks, they are right next to the shoreline. So they're in these coastal environments. And they experience similar deterioration to what we see with shipwrecks. So this is Cape Royds. This is Shackleton's expedition base. And Cape Royds itself had numerous artifacts that we were able to conserve back at the modern base. I then started teaching at East Carolina University in the program in maritime studies. And so I worked with archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians in teaching conservation to kind of non-professionals. So that was a fascinating experience for me. In that time, I got to travel and do archaeology research and shipwreck surveys all over the world. And I also ran a private practice after I left that position in global artifact preservation services. And that also took me to some new places. I think the highlights have really been Alaska, Sudan, and Southern Africa, South Africa, and Namibia. So it's been a very diverse career. And I say to people when they ask me how I've kind of had these experiences, it's really been mentors and colleagues that have seen potential and have allowed me to participate in the research. And so that leads me to today, which is having come to New Zealand. I married into a Taranaki family. My husband, I met him on my second winter in Antarctica, and you have to stay warm somehow. And he was very handsome and had a nice accent. So we hit it off, and we've been married 10 years now. So we moved to Taranaki after we decided we were going to start a family. And in this process, we probably can get jobs a little bit easier in Wellington or Auckland, but we love our region and our families here. So we decided to settle here, which means making your own destiny, I think. So HPFS Solutions was born out of that. You're probably wondering, what is this big black box that says entrance behind me? So this is a climate controlled room. It's actually a marijuana grow room. We don't make secondary income off of that though, but it does make for a really great insulated police helicopter proof room that can be used for climate control. And on the other side of me is a disaster response project. It is in response to several documents that had been in a roof leak incident and had become moldy. And we're working with that partner to try to remediate the mold and respond to that quickly. So we have built this kind of mold chamber here, as you can see in the back, and we've assembled a great team of local people that are very talented, and we have about 6 casual staff now. So we're trying to bring the community into this space. This space is not my space. It is meant to be a community space where we care for special things. So, so a little bit about just kind of how we got here. So tonight, we're here to talk about shipwrecks, not me. So I wanted to talk about what led to this. Is I came to New Zealand as an immigrant and practicing in the heritage profession. And I started to make observations about the kind of world around me and, the shipwreck sites that I wanted to see just out of personal interest, and noticed that they were deteriorating quite quickly or not having much protection around them. So I started to ask questions of fellow professionals and to bring in my own experiences. And I think a lot of immigrants that are in heritage and coming from other countries wanting to practice here, we come from these other models where there's really strong legislation, there's strong research programs, there's strong grants, strong support from the public about maritime heritage and shipwrecks. And we expect to institute those same models in our practices. But I decided to do this PhD so that I didn't just kind of bring those biases with me. I wanted to know, like, what did New Zealanders want? How are things done here? I didn't want to have my red cape on and say, I'm here to save your heritage, when I didn't really know kind of whether people wanted things preserved or what they cared about. So it's been a journey to understand what heritage means in New Zealand. So my central research question to my thesis is, how can community relationships with the preservation of underwater and near water heritage be used to inform heritage profession practices? So I did have a little peek at the audience, and I see some of you are actually people I interviewed, which is super exciting. I will say I'm in my last chapter. I hope to reach out to my communities again before I get to those kind of near final stages. So I've had to take a few breaks along the way, along the years, just to have a family and because of COVID. So it's been a slow process. And but it's a fascinating one that I'm very lucky the audience has come out and supported. So I'm just making sure I'm staying on time here. So, right, what's in a name? I mean, the title is totally packed with lots of buzzwords, right? Shipwrecks, maritime heritage, conservation, cultural materials, community, like it's got all the great words. And I think as a professional, this is how we see shipwrecks and maritime heritage. So in archaeology, we tend to call them submerged cultural heritage, or SCH, submerged cultural resources, underwater cultural heritage. And these terms really vary based on your geographic origin, your professional experiences and disciplines, et cetera. I chose the term underwater and near water heritage because I felt it most encompassed those types of sites that I'm looking at in the thesis. So I have a little medal there because I think that's a really fun phrase to describe it. And I have to contribute something new with this thesis, right? Needless to say, so the sites that I'm looking at are PA sites, petroglyphs, shipwrecks, piers, wharves. It's just a huge range of objects, sites, and Tonga, Waka landing sites, etc. So that I felt like this better encompassed the riverine areas as well that I hope to study. So in conservation, museology, and heritage studies, we tend to refer to these things as material culture, cultural materials, cultural heritage, etc. So I challenge you, are shipwrecks heritage? Are they even resources? Because we tend to call ourselves conservators, which is very similar to conservationists in the natural resources. And we tend to think of cultural resources, at least the model that I came from in the States, as a resource, one that is non-renewable and one that we need to take care of. But that certainly is always debated. Unfortunately, let's see, and I can envision some of you people are saying, well, it depends on whether it's heritage. Is it important? Is it significant? So what do you think it depends on? Please do share your thoughts. So after you're done thinking about what is a shipwreck, I want you to think about how many there are in New Zealand. This information is drafted from a few different places, but I'd be very interested to see the audience's thoughts about how many shipwrecks do you think there are in New Zealand? I purposely am vague about shipwreck. Does it include Maori Tonga, such as Waka? Is it only Pakeha, European designed ships, etc.? I really leave it open to you. With the Waka, it's a little harder to discern how many we have, of course, because the Pakeha records are so dominant in the history. So there are approximately 2,500 known shipwrecks in New Zealand. So again, those are generally based on a desktop survey. We have some incredible published literature out there of authors past and authors living who have studied shipwrecks in New Zealand. So that's the estimate at the moment. If you know differently, please do share. Hopefully that's kind of about what you were thinking. So about 5 of them, as far as I know, Heritage New Zealand, please do correct me. There are about 5 on the Rarangi kōrero list, which is the New Zealand Heritage List. And what is this? Well, this is a list that kind of gives indication of historical or cultural significance to sites. So just to sites, not to individual objects. And there are 2 of those sites in Taranaki. So we're pretty lucky. We have a pretty extensive coastline and a lot of history here, of course, dating back to the land wars and previous to that. So that's not a huge representation. I didn't work out the percentage, but and then lastly, we have shipwreck sites that are listed on district and regional plans. I will say that it's documented that there's inconsistencies between which ones are on the heritage list. So typically the councils are pretty good about listing everything in their plans on what's on the heritage list. And they've got a strong program for that in Heritage New Zealand, Pouhere Taonga, but there are discrepancies. So sometimes there are not similar listings. So that's something that will be kind of hashed out in the following slide here I'll describe. So what legal protections are there? There are 2 types of legal protections for shipwrecks. I'm not going to go too into depth on this, but the dates that we typically use as professionals is 1900 or earlier is considered an archaeological site. So that is the date of the site formation. That is not the date that the ship, was built, but that's when the site, the disaster or the shipwreck or the sinking actually happened. Anything 1900 or prior also includes gazetted sites. That's a funny word. Gazetted is a term that indicates that the site is given the same legal protection as those prior to 1900, but may date later than that. So there's very few sites that are gazetted. I believe there's only a handful. And there's 1 shipwreck on there, the Ventnor, and then the rest are terrestrial sites. Anything post 1900 tends to be listed in the district and regional plans. Remember, I said that's not always thorough or consistent, but those require resource consent, and that's under the Resources Management Act, RMA here. However, we are in the process of looking at how Labor is going to repeal and replace the RMA with the Natural and Built Environment Act. So that'll be interesting to see how heritage is supported in that new act. So those are kind of the two ways that they're legally protected. Right. The other legal, who owns shipwrecks, who's responsible for shipwrecks? That was one of the questions that I asked in my thesis interviews. And you can see in this diagram that this is a graphic that was pulled from MFAT. The white line that's kind of very closely hugging the coastline of New Zealand, that's kind of considered the territorial boundaries. That's about 12 nautical miles offshore. So anything kind of on the seabed or in the coast area is responsibility of the territories. And then the pink area or the red area is the exclusive economic zone. And that's considered more of like a national New Zealand-based, country-based responsibility. And then we have an extended continental shelf, which is mostly for resource exploration and so on, that hasn't been challenged as far as shipwrecks yet. So that's kind of where the responsibility for shipwrecks management lies. And I really wanted to just chat about what is cultural materials conservation as well. Again, in New Zealand, there's a very strong association of the term conservation with the Department of Conservation. They've had an incredibly successful public campaign to restore a lot of natural habitats. Well, we both have the same goal. Our goal is really just to maintain what is there, to, in some cases, we might do restoration, which is to bring back what is missing. Cultural materials, however, is its own specialty within archaeology and within conservation, its own discipline. We abide to a professional code, to an ethical standard through the New Zealand Conservators of Cultural Materials. And that is something that is overseeing not our practices, but certainly is directing what we do. I'm just pulling up my notes on that so I can make sure I've got all of the information correct. But in any case, I just want you to come away from this conversation knowing that we are referred to as conservators, whereas others are referred to as conservationists in the natural resources field. But so this is a picture from Namibia. This was an unexpected midden site from a gold mining camp, and diamond mining camp, I apologize. And it was right on the coastline. And here we came across these records from the diamond mining camp of who the men were, what they got paid, what they ate, et cetera. And it was really, the only thing I had to pack the information in was beer boxes, of course, because that's what you take out in the middle of nowhere. So that was a fun little opportunity to work with local populations. And I have to say that actually kicked off my thesis in a lot of ways, because these men, these men in the picture were locals that just volunteered their time, often just tradesmen and so on. And they did not want these sites protected under the government because it meant that it would restrict access. So that really kicked off like, oh, why wouldn't you want something protected by the government, et cetera? So I want to talk quickly about shipwreck communities. Who are they? This is, again, a very passionate topic for people. And I have some names I want to share, which is just what I'm looking up real quick. Right. So who assigns significance to shipwrecks? It's us, it's people, it's you. So who is a part of the shipwreck community matters. I'm just going to stay here for a second while we examine who cares about shipwrecks. There are, again, stakeholders that are interested professionally, casually, et cetera. Man, are they a passionate group, as I'm sure Heritage New Zealand staff could attest to. And just to highlight some of the people engaged with shipwrecks here in New Zealand, I don't put them in any particular order, but there are maritime archaeologists. So we have Mary O'Keefe, Andy Dodd, Matt Carter, Dr. Kurt Bennett, Matthew Gainsford, Elise Van Loon, and Laura Van Echten. These are all people that have maritime archaeology experience in the country. There are people practicing wet materials conservation like myself. Dilys Johns and Jack Fry are pretty iconic in our field and really the founding people of conservation in so many ways for this material. Sarah Gainsford, Keith Gordon, Rose Evans, Bridget Gallagher, Val Tomlinson, Nissa Mildwaters. So there's quite a few within conservation. Maritime history groups. I won't name the individuals within them, of course, but we've got the Maritime Archaeological Association of New Zealand, MANS, the New Zealand Underwater Heritage Group, the Classic Yacht Charitable Trust. So, but I think they prefer their boats to float. I think they don't like them to sink. So there's, just to say, there's some really great passionate maritime history groups out there. The managing agencies, right? They're a big part of this story. Heritage New Zealand, Pouhere Taonga, the Ministry of Culture and Heritage, Manatū Tonga, Department of Conservation, Te Papa Atawhai is definitely responsible for some of these maritime heritage sites, regional councils, district councils. And we've got some really great maritime museums. Sorry, not specifically maritime per se, but they do have a heavy maritime theme. Mercury Bay, the National New Zealand Maritime Museum, the Edwin Fox Ship and Visitor Center, and Torpedo Bay Naval Museum. So lots of different variety there. The public, right? Visitors to sites and museums. Even recreational divers, underwater clubs, all these different groups didn't really think they were related to shipwrecks and maritime heritage, but that came out in my interviews that they had a close relationship with these sites. Maori, so both Tonga and sites that are within the iwi rohi, we're seeing with a lot of the Waitangi settlements that land that contains these coastal heritage sites that are traditionally Pakeha oriented are going back into iwi responsibility to care for. And so we're watching it unfold how they take the responsibility to care for Pakeha heritage now. And so that's pretty much all the people, all 50 of you that are on the call tonight, I think. Do let me know if I left anybody out, but my purpose is to say that there's a variety of communities that care about this topic and are impassioned about it, and we need to be, because these sites need an advocate. Right, so a little bit more about I see some people are doing some in the chat. That's really great to see. Some really maritime lawyers. Yes, I see there are a few of you in the audience tonight. So great conversation going on so far. Again, passionate group. See if I can click through. So just to kind of bring it back to my thesis research, I interviewed 35 people or groups that all represented some aspect of a community. So these are the specific communities that I interviewed here. What I found is that I really wanted a big cross-section of viewpoints and perspectives. I had a lot of limitations, which I won't go into right now, but what was revealed in this research was the ways in which I made these communities up. So managing agencies did not see themselves as managing agencies. Avocational groups, they really operated on professional levels, and often they perform professional activities. So as a researcher, I kind of discovered I invented these communities. I assigned them identities that they didn't see themselves as. So when I talk about community from here, I kind of mean these groups that I interviewed for my thesis particularly. Some of them are local to Taranaki and some aren't. In these interviews, participants described some of the common ways that they related to underwater and near-water heritage sites and objects. And in a huge majority of the interviews, before I even conducted them, the participant would tell me, I don't know anything about the topic, I can't help you at all. But in all cases, they really had what I believed was a close relationship with these sites. So they had firsthand personal experience. They were significant to them somehow, personally or professionally, but they didn't see them as heritage or as significant. And for others, there was really another extreme where these types of sites really brought them together and they found kinship, they found community themselves. So I found some common themes and kind of that emerged from that. So people seem to value heritage because it's part of New Zealand's history. Pretty obvious, it's historical. People use the heritage still, so therefore it must be significant. People described heritage like this being significant because it's on a list, so it must be important, right? That's great. That's the strength of the heritage list. It must be significant because other people value it. It's significant to Maori, it's significant to that family, et cetera, which is great to see some understanding of other people's heritage. It's as significant because there's still lots of things to learn from it. And lastly, just because it exists, it survived, it is evidence, it somehow made it. And then personal connections. So this was I grouped together these different themes of how people connect to heritage through storytelling. So just that kind of romanticism that we all get enthralled with the history of a ship. The ancestry, we all kind of identified, or you all kind of identified, that your ancestors came to New Zealand by boat. And that is true for both Maori and Pakeha, some of those early settlers. So ancestry and whakapapa was another common theme. Childhood experiences. I mean, New Zealanders have an incredible connection with the outdoors, and specifically in our region with the coast, right? It's sustenance, it's kai. So it's not just the fact that the sites are there. And just coming to mind how one person described her childhood experiences and memories of being out in this coastal environment and just never really seeing the shipwreck. It had been there, but she never thought of it as something significant. It was part of the environment, which was really fascinating. Again, that connection with nature is visceral, both for Maori particularly because they whakapapa back to the natural environment, but also for Pakeha because of the outdoor pursuits that New Zealanders are so known for. I did describe earlier this sense of community that a lot of people have when they join with other collectors, fossickers, historians, the Man's Group, again, the Underwater Heritage Group, et cetera. There's a real sense of community and appreciation for that common theme. And then again, that just physical process of collecting is a nice way to connect with heritage sites. So what's the current state of shipwrecks? Well, I'll just kind of go back to that map. There are really three ways or current environments for shipwrecks. One is that they are remaining in situ. Another is that they're still working. They're actually being used. And then the last, which I'll talk about with each of these case studies, is that they're restored or displayed. This is a map from Lens, and it's really hard to see, I'm sure. There's little blue dots in some areas. So I've tried to bring those out a little bit with this white background. There we go. So if you kind of think about what the outline of New Zealand is, you can see where they're located. Right, folks, this is about 52 that are on the list here. And these are how are they defined? These are shipwreck sites that could foul up a boat or present a hazard in the water, et cetera. So that's why they're pretty close to the coastline. So that's kind of fascinating that there's a variety of inventories that we have of shipwrecks, depending on the significance they play to that organization, that group, that person, et cetera. So I didn't mention, but on my first slide, that picture is an interior photograph from Daring, a shipwreck I'm going to show a picture of in a moment, but it just showed the beautiful chiseling. This picture is also of Daring, which is a personal favorite of mine. Daring is a shipwreck that's been recovered, and you can see she's got this beautiful Muntz medal below her waterline, and it's a copper alloy, and the Muntz medal was used to prevent teredo worms from damaging the wooden hull of the vessel. So it's in incredible condition, so I thought it made a really beautiful background here. So I won't go into too much detail about the history of these vessels. I'll just briefly mention kind of my experience with them. But there are, as I said, over 2,500 known historically shipwrecks. I'm just going to talk about the ones that remain in situ in Taranaki and the ones that are kind of iconic. So the first is the Gairloch. The dates that I have here are not the dates that they were constructed, but the dates that that site formation began, so the dates that they wrecked. So this is steamship Gairloch. In the forefront of the picture, this is Sasha Feiner. She's now a student at the University of Auckland. I believe she's pursuing archaeology and anthropology. She's helping me with a survey called GERT Survey. So this is a program that was brought over by an Australian PhD student. It stands for Gathering Information with Research and Technical Scientific Divers, I believe. That's Andrew Viduka who runs that. And Australia has a very strong maritime archaeology legacy program, legislation, grants, et cetera. So he came over with this program that allows us to document our shipwreck sites through citizen science. These are obviously not underwater, but it was an opportunity for us to experiment with that program and see how well received it would be in New Zealand. So Sasha and another high school student came out with me that day, and here she is drawing the hull, which is at an angle, of course. I like this picture because it also shows this woman with her child. And while we were there was probably 4 groups from the members of the public that came up. It's not too far from a parking lot. It's a little bit of a hike, and you can see that the tide's quite far out. But it was just so awesome. There's 2 generations of people right there. Of course, the baby won't have memories of this, but it was so iconic. This man that came and sat down with his 2 children, I said, oh, have you been out here before? I didn't tell him what we were doing or who we were. And he said, I came out here as a child, and I just wanted to bring my kids back. And they just sat there and enjoyed the environment. I thought it was just a special moment. But in the back, so the Gairloch is obviously quite broken up because of this rocky environment. You can see in the back, there's this little, looks like a submarine almost, and that's the boiler to the Gairloch. So it's spread out quite a distance, and we could not access that. It's not easily accessible. I've been very fortunate in that Andy Dodd is one of the archaeologists who's done an extensive desktop survey and some of the underwater surveys too of these shipwreck sites. So that's where some of this information is gleaned from. Now, I understand there was some interest from Patia around the ship, whether the shipwreck down there was going to be shown tonight, which is exciting, the SS Waitangi. So this was another shipwreck that we surveyed through the GERT program. That information is uploaded to the GERT website. I think you can Google GIRT and shipwreck, and it should come up. You can adopt a shipwreck too. That's what it's about, is everybody participating in this process. There are forms to fill out, and it's very easy to kind of participate through the land-based or coastal-based sites. The SS Waitangi, we did a survey in combination with MANS, the Maritime Archaeological Association of New Zealand, and they brought a crew up from Wellington and elsewhere, and we surveyed the Waitangi, which is exposed on the Patia beach. She comes and goes. I think it gets covered and uncovered approximately every 4 years, but it's been a few years now for this one. So again, not going to go too much into history on these because they deserve a presentation each in their own right, but you can see she's pretty exposed, mostly iron. It's been well deteriorated, and this was a chance that we could document what's left. There's very little documentation on these sites. I should say, there are ways that we can contribute, that you can contribute, and maybe you already have, but you can make a submission to the heritage list, and there's information on the Heritage New Zealand website about how to do that. And we could get more shipwreck sites on that list through that submission process if you were passionate about it and wanted to see change in the world. The most important thing, all these shipwreck sites, I mean, look how close they are to the water. There's a lot of natural deterioration factors. There are people who collect off of them. There are people who climb on them and sit on them. That's not great for the structure because the structure can collapse and fail. But most of the deterioration on our Taranaki coastline, they don't call us hardcore Taranaki for no reason, you guys, is because we do have a hardcore coastal environment. So that's what's causing a lot of the damage. What are we going to do about it, right? Another site is the SS Airedale. This is only as seen during ultra low tides. I made my toddler go for a beach walk with me. That might be him standing in the background. And he waited for me on the beach while I ran out to document this shipwreck real quick before we had to get home and get dinner on the table. So it's interesting. There's not much left of the Airedale, and she only becomes exposed in those kind of not so frequent ultra low tides. But the Tasmanian Maid, so this is one of those shipwreck sites that's on the heritage list, and she dates to about 1868. So she is a protected archaeological site. Again, nobody has looked at these sites in years. So who knows what condition they're in, and that's a challenge for us professionally and for the managing agencies and how they manage these sites. The SS Alexandra is another site considered an protected archaeological site. Not many photos I got. I didn't put a source on here, but they're both from Heritage New Zealand. I think Andy Dodd investigated the Tasmanian Maid, and I apologize, I've forgotten who investigated the Alexandra in this case. Right, so those are some fun in situ shipwrecks around Taranaki that are super romantic and super fun and accessible for people to visit, which you often see in our promotional literature. There are examples of sites still working. This is in Wanganui, these 2 vessels, the Waimarie. You'd probably be well familiar with this. Maybe you've been on it with your family, which is super exciting. Both this ship and the next one were riverboats, and they sunk into the river mud and were pulled up and restored. So again, this date, 1952, is the date that it kind of last sunk into the mud. And those ships definitely deserve their own presentations because that is lengthy restoration processes. The PSY Rua is another one in Wanganui, a riverboat too. One is owned privately and one is owned by a trust. And then, so I don't know of too many others that are operating. So when I say shipwreck, one that like really sunk to the bottom of the river or the sea and then was recovered and restored, which represents its own kind of challenges. But if you do know of others that are used that had been sunken shipwrecks, please do let me know. Then we have some around the country that are restored and displayed. I think I'm missing probably two from this list that are metal hauled, but the SS Toroa, that's a fascinating one. So it was in operation from 1925 to 1980. Perhaps you're familiar with this, or perhaps you're working on the restoration of the project. If you are, I wish I had $1 million to give you guys. Really, there's so many worthy efforts out there for these projects. This is had a pretty famous history and was on operation for a long time. So they've just made the news, I believe, in some of their new efforts to reinstate the steel girders or the framing in the hull, internal hull. So that's up in Auckland, right near the highway. The Daring. So Daring holds a special place in my heart. So Daring was a shipwreck site that you might be familiar with. It was recovered off the beach about 2 years ago by a very passionate community group under the funding and oversight of the Classic Yacht Charitable Trust. So again, just a group of people that are really passionate about seeing historic yachts preserved and used and enjoyed. So Daring was a little different for them, but it's been an incredible story of Daring being recovered from Muriwai Beach and taken to Mungawhai, where it currently stands, and which is where it was originally built. And now it's under the auspices of the Mungawhai Daring Trust. And again, I'd love to speak more to this topic. I didn't forewarn the Mungawhai group that I was going to do anything, so I've just kind of presented it here from a public perspective. You can actually see the vessel from this perspective, seeing it straight on. I don't believe they're taking public into the space yet, but you can see it's in pretty incredible condition, and all because a very passionate group of the community stepped forward to do that and is continuing to. So a lot of these projects are continuing to seek funds if you were interested in supporting them. Again, I mentioned those are two wooden hulled vessels. The PS Rangiriri is one I just saw in Hamilton. This is a metal hulled vessel. This was a riverboat vessel, a paddle wheel steamer, and she brought cargo and people up and down the river. It's in pretty poor condition. There's a lot of debris on the ground. It's, as you can see, the date does make it an archaeological site, but there's not too much. Obviously, there's been an extensive restoration at some point, but people have been jumping the fence and climbing in the boat to drink and socialize, it looks like. And the Edwin Fox. So Dr. Kurt Bennett has just done some of his thesis on this, and it's an incredible story too. It did sink for a little bit, I understand, but it's now currently in dry dock under a large roof structures to keep it dry. And this is how she looks. Sorry, the picture's not very clear, but this is how she looks nowadays. So you can go there and see her yourself. The PS Kopu. So this one is an interesting story. It's also been recovered from a sunken environment. The date makes it an archaeological site. It is also sitting just kind of under an open air shed, we call them. And when I corresponded with the group up there, they said she's not in great condition. She's just kind of sitting under the shed and nothing's really ever been done. Although I believe that a conservation assessment was done and conservation treatment recommendations were put forward at some stage quite some time ago, but nothing really progressed with that. So she's in Pairoa, I believe. The Plimmers Ark, Inconstant. So some of you would be well versed in this story. The Inconstant is the original vessel's name that she was commissioned under, but she's part of Wellington's history, pretty significant. So she was converted to John Plimmer's warehouse and dry dock. And this is the bow section that's currently on display under the Old Bank Arcade in Wellington. And she's another one that's been conserved and put on display for the public. So, right, those are just some really fun case studies that I've gotten to see or participate in. What does all this mean for the future of heritage in this country? So my experience and my perspective coming in here as an immigrant, wanting to learn more about heritage, is that it's really told me that the future of heritage in this country is not in the government agencies. It's not in the universities and the humanities programs. It's in the community. And that has completely changed the way that I practice as a conservator and as an archaeologist. And so I just want to give a call out to you guys. Like, you're the ones that are really driving a lot of these preservation, identification, management of these sites and contributing to our knowledge. There's just not enough of us to document these sites. There's not enough money, not enough manpower to do it ourselves, being professionals and managing agencies. So we need community members to do that. For me, what that new model has looked like and how it's transformed my own practice here in the studio is it's meant that conversations around what heritage means, and I will say that is a term that none of my participants really used. Heritage is not something we mutually agree on in New Zealand. So we have a long way to go in conversations about what we see significant as a people, as a country. So this space that I'm sitting in is meant to be an opportunity to hold space for those conversations. We had a public archaeology night the other night for NZA Archaeology Week, and it was a great opportunity to bring the public into the space and say, this is what we do, this is why it matters, and this is how you can participate in that process too. So a lot of what my PhD research has resulted in is a new way of me practicing and just having the opportunity to have conversations with the public around what is maritime heritage, do you think it's important, et cetera. It's also about meeting in the middle. So a lot of past practices have been what we call top-down or expert-driven. I certainly felt that way before I started this PhD, in that I held the knowledge about processes, sites, archaeology, conservation. This process really humbled me into respecting that I'm actually not the expert. I am one of those communities that contributes to the knowledge around these shipwreck sites and around these histories and around how to do conservation. In the iwi communities and the hapu and whānau communities that I work with, it's very much a collaborative process. So it's about not necessarily top-down or bottom-up type models, but about meeting in the middle. We all have something to contribute to this. So I've changed my practices to be more inclusive, be more open, and less expert-driven, really. And in that process, it's made me change my language. I don't use the term recommendations necessarily when working with communities. We use the term considerations, and that just puts us on a playing level that I'm not necessarily the one who's going to tell you what to do. It's up to you to make that decision, as well as heritage. So I really haven't found a good word that Kiwis use to encompass all of these types of sites. And then lastly, just conservation. So I don't use that term a whole lot. I use the term care now because it's more encompassing, more familiar, less jargony, and less associated with the natural resources. So I think I've nattered on long enough, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts. So I just want to say thank you so much, Ngā nui, and just to say that this research is really funded through 2 grants that I got through the doctoral scholarship. I hope to finish this PhD up this year. So if I can answer any questions, or if you want to reach out after the presentation, my details are all here. I'd love to have a conversation around it. Thank you so much.
Kia ora, Suzanne. Thank you very much. That was really great. So it's now time for a few questions. So if you want to send them through, please do so. And I'll just kick off with one question of my own. So are most of the ships that you work on above or below water?
Are most of the ships that I work on above or below water? So I have been a diver. I've got a technical diving certification, which means I can use, different mixes and so on to go deep. But I haven't dove in quite a few years in New Zealand. So I would say most of them are above water, and that's because it's also been about bringing community into the work. So being able to scuba dive is a privilege, and not everybody has access to those resources. So, and also our coastline, I didn't really respect. I grew up and I trained in Florida, right? Sugar white beaches and crystal clear waters and so on. So it's been a different environment for me to see that there's only probably a few good days of the year that you can actually see shipwrecks along our coastline diving. I never thought about that. Thank you, Miranda.
Great. Thanks, Susanne. Hey, there's been a bit of a discussion in the chat with some people around the 1900 cutoff, which we have in the legal framework in New Zealand around things that are post-1900 aren't as well protected under the law as things as pre-1900. And I'm just wondering, in your discussions with people, you know, how that's come up and what your thoughts on that might be. Some people are saying, one person's saying, it's a problem, we should really do something about it. I wonder if you'd agree with that.
My understanding, and Mary O'Keefe can comment to this more because she's written about the history of these back and forth dates. I believe at one point there was a rolling deadline in the States. It's 50 years or earlier is considered an archaeological site. And I think that has been a part of the conversation in the past or part of the legal system. But my impression, since you're asking me, is that it's mixed. Like some archaeologists believe that is sufficient, and others are really adamant that we need to start considering an alternative. So it's mixed. My particular perspective as a materials culture conservator is that, cultural materials conservator, is that we have such a dynamic and significant history after 1900, and it's going to continue. History is living, right? I believe we should be adjusting our consideration of what constitutes an archaeological site, but I also appreciate there's a lot more that goes into that legal framework and conversation. So
thank you. Have you ever had the opportunity to work on waka?
Oh, what a lovely question. Is this a question from you or from the audience?
From me.
Oh, good. Oh, excellent. Yes. Yes, I've been fortunate to be a partner with the Ministry of Culture and Heritage, Manitou Tonga, in some of their mahi around waka, and also to be guided by Dilys Johns, who has been working with waka for decades, and just admire her work too, that she's been working with Māori communities and so on. So yes, that I have been fortunate to work with Tonga. We live in Taranaki in a very extensive rohi that has a lot of swamplands and wet areas for those types of materials. So we do find them quite often. And we have a big project coming up with Mount Messenger that will go through swamplands, and not that waka are that far inland, but I think it's something that we will continue to see more of, more Tonga exposed as developments occur. Yeah. Very special type of Tonga. Every day I feel privileged to get to work with people's heritage. I never take it for granted. Something that I may not personally see as significant, I never take for granted that it is important to somebody else. And particularly with Māori communities, it's been a lot of years building up trust, building up my knowledge. I confess that when I first came to New Zealand and started investigating PhD topics, I really had Pākehā paralysis. I didn't want to go into that space of Māori Tonga and caring for it because it wasn't something I was real familiar with. I'd worked with other Indigenous societies, but I started to just kind of quietly learn more and quietly talk more to Māori communities and learn more te reo, and just quietly tick away and become more comfortable with that. And it's been so rewarding to have the community support this mahi because it is so needed in Taranaki. And they have come and blessed our space. They have come and participated in kōrero around how to care for Tonga. And it's not just about us doing private work, it's about us contributing to the community too. So thank you for asking that question, because it is important that I acknowledge how the community has come out from Māori communities too.
Thank you, Susanne. I think this might be almost the final question because we are getting towards 7 o'clock. But we have a question from Jeanette Shepherd, who's asking you, which is a great question for a nearly finished PhD student. What do you have in mind for your future research?
Oh gosh, just want to change the world. There's so much to do out there, isn't it? I'm one of those people that just is always asking, well, how can we do it differently? How can we do it better? What a great question, Jeanette. I have a toddler, so at the moment, I'm just looking forward to to focusing on family after that. But there is a lot of opportunity to do more. A lot of the sites that we have in our region are undocumented. They're desktop surveys that Andy had done, so we don't even know if they're still there, how much of them exist. So I think a lot of my future plans are just to get a sense of how we can start to implement these programs within our own region, to document them and just continue to hold that space and give back. I am so privileged to be able to do a PhD and to do it on this topic. And I want to make sure that I'm able to give back through that and through this practice.
Right. Super. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we can all see from your energy and enthusiasm and all the things that you've touched on, even briefly in this, how much there is and how much your passion extends to it. So it's been really fantastic presentation. I know I've seen in the chat there are people involved, as you say, in community efforts throughout the country as volunteers at these various sites, and as staff as well, people are interested in more seminars about more shipwrecks. So you're clearly tapping into the interested community here. I know we've all kind of learned something new and kind of appreciated your enthusiasm and knowledge for the subject. So thank you so much, Susanne, for kind of pulling together a fascinating overview of your work and how it touches so many elements of the wider community. We really appreciate your time and your mahi in this space.
Oh,
and
great. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to finish up for this evening, Miranda will just finish with our karakia.
Unuhia, unuhia. Unuhia ki te uru tapu nui. Kia wātea, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua I te ara takatū. Koia rā I rongo, whakairia ake ki runga kia tina, homie huie taikie.
Kia ora koutou, ngā muhi o te pō. Good evening to you all. We'll just leave the chat open for a couple more minutes. I know people usually want to write thank yous and things like that. You're welcome to do that, or head off for your fish and chips, your wine, or some time with your toddler. Kia ora.
Kia ora.